A red warning light blinked above the film processing room deep inside the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center. Technicians wheeled in the latest delivery-sealed canisters of ultra-fine reconnaissance film. No one spoke. Everyone knew what it contained. 3 days earlier, a satellite codenamed Corona 71 had passed silently over Soviet territory. At precisely 3:27 GMT, it executed a programmed roll, exposing a 24-inch strip of advanced resolution film over a dense patch of forest in central Kazakhstan. To Soviet generals, that patch was nothing. To American analysts, it was everything. As the film unspooled beneath high-resolution projectors, the room fell silent. Then, one frame in an image technician gasped. A senior interpreter leaned closer. Pause that. Enhance. Under magnification, a cluster of long, rectangular shapes emerged. Perfect geometry, angular shadows, vehicles, cranes. Access roads branching from a hardened facility with perimeter fencing. What they saw next confirmed it. Soviet SS-7 and SS-8 ICBM silos, exactly where Moscow had claimed none existed. One analyst, stunned, whispered. This wasn't even on the map. There were at least 6 silos, semi-hardened launch pads, and a construction depot still bearing active crane structures nearby. Shadows revealed bunker entrances camouflaged, but not well enough. A convoy of transporters had left behind unmistakable tread patterns in the soil. This wasn't just a military base. It was an active missile launch facility, and the Soviets had no idea it had just been photographed from 100 miles above. By 0600 the next morning, the imagery had already been briefed to the National Security Council. A 3-star Air Force general, thumbing through the glossy prints, looked up at the president's science advisor and asked, "You sure they don't know we saw this?" The advisor replied. "They think the clouds covered it." But they hadn't, and now, for the first time in Cold War history, the United States had unquestionable photographic proof of a Soviet missile field hidden, operational, and never declared in Moscow. The morning routine continued without interruption. Generals reviewed outdated readiness reports. Party officials approved sanitized missile production data. No one knew the game had already changed. That by the time Soviet intelligence realized what had happened, it was already too late. Inside a heavily guarded conference room within the Kremlin's Ministry of Defense, Soviet generals surrounded a polished oak table, trading updates with ritualized calm. As far as they knew, the ICBM program was progressing flawlessly. The deception protocols, decoy silos, mobile launchers, construction dummy sites had worked. NATO had no eyes in the sky sharp enough to distinguish the real from the fake, or so they thought. For years, Soviet military doctrine operated on one fundamental belief. Western imagery was limited by physics, resolution thresholds, orbital drift, weather interference, each factor, in the minds of Soviet planners, degraded any real threat posed by American reconnaissance. "A camera is not a spy," one marshal famously quipped. "It sees, but it cannot understand." Soviet photographic interpreters had their own estimates of Western satellite capability, most based on outdated U-2 flight data and assumed gaps between imaging satellites. Khrushchev's inner circle was convinced that Soviet camouflage systems, multispectral nets, terrain masking, and false infrastructure had effectively blinded NATO's eyes. The Politburo reinforced this fantasy with numbers. Defense reports claimed dozens of missile launch complexes were undetectable due to location, terrain, or mobile deployment. Internal briefings emphasized redundancy if the West found 1 or 2. The rest would survive, but the assumptions didn't stop there. Kremlin strategists believed secrecy itself was a weapon. If the U.S. didn't know what to target, it couldn't risk a first strike. Therefore, The appearance of concealment, even if incomplete, was psychologically as effective as actual invisibility. This dogma, repeated at every level of planning, built a false sense of immunity. Worse, Soviet analysts clung to a Cold War superstition that the U.S. would never publicly reveal what it had truly seen, out of fear of exposing its technological hand. That meant any photo shared in the media or diplomatic leaks was assumed to be old, distorted, or intentionally vague. Therefore, even if a facility was spotted, Moscow believed Washington wouldn't act on it. All of this combined into a dangerous delusion. By 1970, Soviet missile site planning had become more focused on maintaining deception protocols than on modernizing actual survivability. Engineers were instructed to delay construction if satellite flyovers were suspected. Entire fields were built to be photographed, only to be abandoned, reinforcing the illusion of mobility and unpredictability. But what no one in that Kremlin room understood yet was that America's cameras had evolved. They no longer captured guesses. They captured truth. And the first frame of truth had already been developed in a CIA darkroom. For decades, the Soviet Union had relied on an unshakable military doctrine: what cannot be seen cannot be struck. This belief was foundational. It shaped the very geometry of Soviet missile fields built into forests, behind hills, disguised under false roofs, or cloaked with decoys. It dictated launch protocols, dispersal strategies, even the scheduling of construction shifts to coincide with U.S. satellite flyovers. At the heart of this doctrine was maskirovka, the grand Soviet art of deception. From WWII onward, Soviet military planners had elevated concealment into a strategic science. But with missile command, that art became almost dogmatic. By the early 1970s, missile concealment was no longer a tactic. It was a sacred assumption. Soviet launch sites were designed to appear as civilian structures. Mobile missile launchers would be parked near tractor depots or rail yards. Trees were selectively planted to block overhead view lines. Some complexes went so far as to use inflatable equipment, fake fuel trucks, and phony heat signatures designed to confuse infrared sensors. They had reason to believe it worked. Early U.S. U-2 flights had faced significant cloud cover and resolution limits. Initial satellite programs like Discoverer and Corona had wide-angle optics that prioritized coverage over clarity. Soviet generals assumed they had time before resolution improved enough to make real surveillance actionable. They were wrong. By the early 1970s, American optics had leapt forward. New generations of film-returned satellites could resolve objects down to 2 feet across, with stereoscopic depth, sun angle timing, and infrared overlays. While the Soviets obsessed over visual deception, U.S. analysts had begun measuring shadow length, vehicle spacing, and heat dispersion to infer function and readiness. Still, the Soviet Missile Command stuck to their foundational principle: concealment equals immunity. Worse, internal testing reinforced the illusion. Soviet radar detection tests showed high-altitude overflights had blind spots. They assumed satellites would suffer similar limitations. Exercises simulated NATO bombers, not orbital cameras. When Soviet engineers suggested rethinking site camouflage or investing in satellite decoys, they were dismissed. "No American camera will ever see our real launch posture," one general declared. "If they do, we'll know before they do." But that last part wasn't true anymore. Because by the time a KH-7 satellite snapped the first photograph of an uncamouflaged SS-8 complex near Plesetsk, the missiles had already been fueled, exposed, and recovered. And no one in Moscow had even noticed. The doctrine was cracking not from above, but from within its own false confidence. The first true rupture came from a strip of acetate film no longer than a school ruler. In late spring 1971, A KH-8 Gambit satellite, one of the most advanced American reconnaissance platforms at the time, completed a pass over the Arkhangelsk region of northern Russia. Its cameras, capable of capturing objects smaller than a basketball from orbit, had been programmed to focus on a wide clearing previously tagged as non-priority terrain. But what emerged from the film processing lab stunned even the most senior imagery analysts. The frame showed a rectangular launch complex tucked between dense pine forests, clean concrete lines, two fully extended fueling towers, a convoy of tankers pulling away from a hardened shelter. The geometry was unmistakable, an SS-9 SCARP ICBM silo array, operational, prepped, and aligned with targeting protocols. It wasn't just a launch site. It was an active, nuclear-ready base that had never been mentioned in Soviet disclosures, never identified in previous overflights, never even acknowledged in defector intelligence. Even more chilling, one of the silos appeared to have no blast door in place. Its inner chamber circular, shielded, and missile-ready was visible from space. Analysts at the National Reconnaissance Office knew instantly what this meant. The site had been under maintenance or mid-drill during the satellite pass. The Soviets had no idea the timing had aligned so precisely. They had been caught mid-exposure. The CIA immediately classified the imagery as level black and routed it directly to the White House. When shown the photo, a senior Air Force general reportedly said, "We can read the Cyrillic stenciling on the fuel trucks." For the United States, it was confirmation of a long-suspected truth. The USSR's missile posture was not nearly as hidden as it claimed. In fact, it was vulnerable not to bombers or missiles, but to evidence. But inside the Soviet Union, no one knew the image existed. Their missile crews had gone through their shift. Their tankers had refueled. Their guards had rotated. And in Washington, a high-resolution print of their every move now sat in a locked folder labeled Confirmed Target Complex Bravo. This moment shattered an illusion. It wasn't just that the U.S. could see Soviet missiles. It was that they could see everything. And no one in Moscow had even blinked. The first impossible event had occurred. The myth of invisibility was now documented, dated, and filed. And it had happened in broad daylight. When fragments of the U.S. satellite imagery findings were quietly leaked to NATO intelligence partners. A familiar panic gripped the Soviet leadership, but it didn't show in public. Not yet. Inside a steel-walled conference room at the KGB's First Directorate, a dozen senior officers pored over Western press clippings and intercepted radio chatter. Rumors were spreading among Western analysts of a breakthrough in orbital resolution. British and French liaisons were reportedly reassessing their missile vulnerability assessments based on new American visuals. Back in Moscow, Defense Minister Grechko dismissed the claims outright. Fabrications, psychological operations, he snapped, slamming a crimson folder shut. The Americans want us to overreact. But not everyone agreed. One Soviet aerospace analyst cautiously raised the possibility that a new American satellite had outpaced their own prediction models. He pointed to a sudden uptick in U.S. reconnaissance flyovers and satellite orbital paths that, while publicly attributed to weather monitoring, had repeatedly passed over known missile complexes. His warning was ignored. The Kremlin's political machinery couldn't afford to admit the vulnerability. To do so would require revising decades of doctrine, restructuring air defense coordination, and perhaps worst of all, conceding that Soviet secrecy wasn't unbreakable. Instead, a counter-narrative was adopted. The American photographs, they insisted, must have been digitally altered, or else fed by traitors. One advisor even suggested that the U.S. was using movie set replicas to simulate Soviet bases for propaganda. Others pointed to Western disinformation efforts as proof that the CIA was trying to disrupt strategic parity before the next round of SALT negotiations. So the Kremlin doubled down. They issued internal circulars reaffirming the integrity of their missile concealment protocols. Missile crews were ordered to maintain existing camouflage schedules. Site expansions continued without any new guidance regarding satellite visibility. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence silently watched it all unfold, frame by frame, pass by pass. The next KH-8 drop revealed the same missile base, this time with updated vehicles, fresh concrete pads, and a third silo under construction. Still, no adjustments in Soviet behavior. To outside observers, this looked like confidence. In reality, it was paralysis, the refusal to adapt in the face of invisible defeat. The Soviet Union couldn't accept that it had been seen, and so it acted like it hadn't. But the truth was already hanging in satellite vaults across the U.S., documented, cataloged, undeniable. Faced with a growing storm of indirect evidence and whispers from the West, the Soviet security apparatus needed a narrative that didn't involve admitting a catastrophic intelligence failure, so they reached for a familiar crutch: espionage. In late 1971, Soviet counterintelligence agents drafted an internal assessment suggesting that the U.S. imagery breakthroughs weren't truly technological at all. According to their theory, American satellites were simply confirming what they already knew: information obtained from deep-cover spies inside the strategic rocket forces. It was a comforting fiction. If the Americans had maps, coordinates, even the construction schedules of new missile sites, it must be because someone had leaked them. Perhaps a traitor, perhaps a bribed technician, but certainly not because a camera 100 miles above Earth had pierced the veil of Soviet defense. This theory gave Soviet leadership an excuse to maintain the illusion of control. If the problem was human, it could be contained, arrested, discredited, forgotten. KGB Section 7 launched sweeping background checks across missile-based personnel. Security clearances were reviewed, communication logs pulled, and rumors of defectors re-examined. One colonel was quietly removed from command after a chance encounter with a foreign journalist was reinterpreted as possible subversion. Yet, through it all, there was no hard evidence of a mole, no intercepted messages, no signs of espionage that matched the precision and timing of the American satellite revelations. Still, the Soviet military clung to the narrative. They ordered security hardening at all major ICBM sites. This included physical barriers, communication scramblers, and personnel rotations. But no changes were made to launch site layouts, camouflage protocols, or above-ground activity patterns, the very things U.S. satellites could continue to observe with total clarity. The irony was brutal in chasing ghosts on the ground. Moscow ignored the very real eyes in the sky. Inside the CIA, analysts marveled at the consistency of Soviet behavior. Despite multiple satellite passes and corroborating signals intelligence, Soviet missile field activity remained unchanged. They're looking for a traitor. One U.S. photo interpreter said, "When the traitor is orbital physics." The wrong theory gave the Kremlin temporary comfort, but it also delayed the only action that could have helped strategic reform. Instead, the Soviet Union continued building a missile empire under the assumption that its core was hidden. But in reality, the entire empire was already indexed, imaged, and exposed from space. When weeks passed with no proof of a spy inside their missile forces, the Soviet High Command shifted targets. The mole theory had failed. So they reached for a second explanation, one that felt both scientific and self-flattering. The new hypothesis: American imaging satellites weren't actually seeing missile sites. They were misinterpreting terrain features. In closed-door briefings at Baikonur and the Kremlin, senior Soviet scientists pushed an argument rooted in atmospheric physics. They claimed that solar angles, terrain shadows, snow cover, or even lens distortions could create the illusion of structures where none existed. One geospatial analyst went so far as to claim the satellite photos showing launch pads were, in fact, optical mirages caused by seasonal temperature gradients on the steppes. A Defense Ministry report circulated, but never published, suggested that American analysts had become victims of pattern bias, reading missile infrastructure into random civilian layouts. It was pseudoscience packaged as policy. To make matters worse, the Soviet scientific elite, many of whom depended on military contracts, were happy to support the theory. They feared the alternative that their own camouflage systems had failed. As a result, field commanders were ordered to conduct surveys of known missile regions, documenting vegetation patterns, soil gradients, and construction shadows. Photographs were taken, satellite flyovers predicted, and terrain optics maps created. The idea was to compare American photos, though they had no access to them with theoretical Soviet perspectives, and then conclude that the West was simply seeing things wrong. Inside the Central Committee, this became gospel American imaging. Success was not a failure of Soviet secrecy, but a flaw in American understanding. But behind the scenes, cracks were widening. A few Soviet engineers, quietly and at great personal risk, began submitting anonymous concerns. If they are misinterpreting shadows, one note read, "Why do their guesses always align with where our fuel trucks go?" Others asked if their photos are wrong. Why are they requesting diplomatic clarification about facilities we never admitted existed? In Washington, U.S. officials were tracking Soviet rhetoric and noted with bemusement how elaborate the denials had become. The Americans weren't guessing. They were tracking heat plumes, comparing multiple angle passes, counting vehicle types, and timing fuel cycles. Every photo was corroborated with infrared overlays and signal intercepts. And still, the Soviets insisted they're seeing rocks and mistaking them for missiles. But they weren't. They were seeing missiles and the crumbling logic of a superpower unable to face its own exposure. By late 1972, the Soviets had all the warning signs. Multiple missile complexes, Plesetsk, Yoshkar-Ola. Dombarovsky had been observed conducting fuel operations during U.S. satellite passes. Logistics convoys had been imaged, analyzed, and confirmed. And still, no countermeasures had been enacted. The KGB's own satellite watch division, known as Directorate S, had fallen behind in orbital prediction. Their tracking of American overflights relied on models that were weeks out of date. Soviet orbital surveillance still operated under the assumption that KH series satellites passed over on predictable, linear orbits. But the U.S. had begun maneuvering them, slightly adjusting inclination, delaying deorbits, and chaining passes across multiple platforms. That meant Moscow no longer knew when it was being watched. This was the core intelligence failure, not just that American satellites were more powerful, but that they were invisible in plain sight. Soviet analysts couldn't reconcile the frequency of image-based revelations with their belief in satellite predictability. The cracks widened when NATO negotiators at the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, SALT, began referencing unacknowledged missile sites, exactly matching locations never publicly declared by the USSR. The Soviets were stunned. How did they know the Americans never revealed their sources? But the implication was chilling. Not only had the U.S. seen the hidden silos they were willing to base treaties on them. Suddenly, the Soviet bluff was crumbling. Internal panic surged. Special commissions were ordered to audit all strategic rocket forces' security. Missile construction teams were interrogated about scheduling anomalies. Ground crews were warned not to leave fueling equipment outside silos. New camouflage nets were ordered massive, infrared dispersing ones, but production delays meant they wouldn't be delivered for another year. Meanwhile, U.S. satellites captured images of those very same facilities, unprotected. Back in Langley, CIA analysts knew something the Soviets did not. The U.S. had cracked Soviet launch cycle patterns. By combining film returns with intercepted telemetry, Washington could now determine missile readiness states from orbit alone. They could count fuel trucks, measure launch scaffold positions, even assess crew presence by the layout of surrounding vehicles. And yet, unbelievably, the Soviets still hadn't changed protocols. This was the final intelligence failure. Not a gap in tools or awareness, but a total collapse of adaptability. A belief system so rigid, it couldn't accept what was happening in front of it. One Soviet colonel, writing privately in a classified assessment years later, put it bluntly. "We were not blind, we were blinking. And every time we blinked, they took another picture." The Soviet Union had always assumed that the American reconnaissance program was monolithic, a few satellites, a few analysts, and a fixed rotation of imagery collection. What they didn't realize until it was far too late was that the United States had built a layered, redundant, and self-correcting surveillance ecosystem capable of global dominance in information warfare. It began with Corona, the earliest photographic satellite system, which taught U.S. intelligence one invaluable lesson: no single image is enough. By the late 1960s, that doctrine had evolved into a sophisticated architecture that combined optical imaging, infrared scanning, radio signal interception, and orbital telemetry tracking. Each part reinforced the others. Each piece could confirm or disprove what the other suspected. When a KH-8 Gambit satellite snapped a photo of a new Soviet facility, that information wasn't stored in isolation. It was run against U-2 overflight data from years prior, cross-checked against SIGINT logs from the NSA's listening posts, and even compared to commercial shipping manifests. If a single concrete truck had visited the region in excess, it was logged. The Americans didn't look for silos. They looked for patterns. This was the real strength of the system, the fusion of agencies, and the speed of interpretation. By the 1970s, imagery from a successful satellite drop could be delivered to CIA analysts, processed, interpreted, and briefed to the White House all within 36 hours. This gave the United States something the Soviets could never match: strategic tempo. At the heart of this system was the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, a shadow agency so secret it wasn't even acknowledged publicly until decades later. The NRO coordinated satellite orbits, managed launch schedules, and prioritized targets in real time. Meanwhile, inside the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, entire teams of analysts worked in silence, developing film with tools so precise they could identify a wrench left on a maintenance cart. These weren't just photo interpreters. They were forensic reconstruction experts. Every angle, every shadow, every anomaly was analyzed. And then there was the software: early, crude, but deadly effective. The CIA's computer systems could now estimate structure height from shadow length, calculate fuel capacity from tank dimensions, and identify missile types from vehicle chassis spacing. Nothing was left to guesswork. Even weather was weaponized. If clouds covered a site, another satellite was diverted. If resolution faltered, orbital inclination was adjusted. Nothing was fixed. Everything was dynamic. And perhaps most terrifying for the Soviets, none of this required direct overflight anymore. The age of U-2s was fading. Cameras in space could now see what no pilot ever could. The result. By the time a Soviet ICBM was rolled out for readiness drills, it had already been seen, tracked, cataloged, and in some cases, targeted. Soviet command never understood that America wasn't reacting to their moves. America was anticipating them. In 1973, the United States played its most devastating hand, not with a missile, but with a photograph. at the SALT II pre-negotiation summit in Geneva. A carefully curated image was placed in front of the Soviet delegation. It showed a high-resolution satellite photo of a newly constructed ICBM complex in southern Kazakhstan. Every silo, every fuel truck, every antenna tower, even the crew vehicles parked in their staging bays. The Soviets froze. They had declared no such facility. There had been no official notice, no hint in public records. The site wasn't even operational yet. Yet, there it was on glossy photo paper, annotated in English, with the caption, Kazakhstan Site 23, 245 Zulu observation. The American diplomat smiled politely. "We'd like to discuss strategic transparency," he said. That moment shattered any remaining Soviet illusions. What followed wasn't just embarrassment. It was institutional collapse of confidence. Back in Moscow, the humiliation triggered a cascade of internal inquiries. Ministers demanded to know how the Americans had found the site. The KGB accused the Strategic Rocket Forces of leaking. The Rocket Forces accused the Space Surveillance Directorate of negligence. Scientists were summoned, grilled, and dismissed, and the photos kept coming. Within months, additional images surfaced, some shared publicly, some slipped quietly into diplomatic cables. They showed classified submarine bases, mobile launcher drills, even a previously undisclosed early warning radar station in Siberia. The US didn't need to make threats. It only needed to reveal the truth. In response, the Soviets launched frantic construction programs to build fake sites and decoys, inflatable silos, dummy equipment, trucks driving in circular patterns to mimic active bases. But it was too late. The Americans already had historical imagery, time-lapsed growth patterns, ground compression data, vehicle movement logs. They knew what was real. Every new deception was now visible in reverse. What the Soviets faced was something no doctrine had prepared them for: the slow, relentless erosion of secrecy. Their greatest strength, strategic ambiguity, was now gone. Their enemy could see through concrete. And in every closed-door meeting, from Missile Command to the Politburo, one question began to dominate. If they know where our missiles are, can they destroy them all first? The humiliation wasn't about being watched. It was about being pre-targeted in silence, from above, by an adversary who never fired a shot, but still struck first in the one domain that mattered most information. This was not a Cold War skirmish. It was a surgical defeat with a camera as the weapon. The Soviet Union had spent decades cultivating a myth that it could hide its strength, obscure its intent, and shield its strategic forces behind veils of secrecy and maskirovka. But by the mid-1970s, that myth had crumbled under the lens of American orbital dominance. What emerged in its place was not simply vulnerability. It was a gaping ideological wound. For a superpower built on secrecy, the collapse of concealment was the collapse of control. The very concept of deterrence depended on uncertainty. If the enemy knew the exact location, status, and vulnerability of every warhead, then first strike survivability, the linchpin of mutual assured destruction, was dead. This wasn't just a military failure. It was a strategic unraveling, internally. Soviet planners began to whisper about total visibility. A term once relegated to science fiction became a terrifying reality. If satellites could see everything, what point was there in expanding ICBM fields? What good were launch drills if they were logged, time-stamped, and archived in Langley within hours? The psychological toll was immense. Young missile officers trained under the assumption of invincibility were now being told, privately, that they operated in a glass box. Some units tried rotating equipment at odd hours. Others deployed under overcast skies in the hope that clouds would buy them time. But nothing stopped the cold logic of satellite coverage. One intelligence director even proposed launching balloons filled with reflective chaff to confuse imaging sensors. The idea was dismissed, not because it wouldn't work, but because it admitted the truth. To fight the eyes in the sky was to admit they existed. In Politburo sessions, proposals for counter-satellite programs were drafted. Laser blinders, co-orbital interceptors, jamming satellites. Billions were poured into development, but they were years too late, and the Americans already knew the funding schedules. The ideological collapse echoed through the Soviet military-industrial complex. Factories began demanding more funds to build facilities invisible to orbit. Strategic doctrine papers started including references to orbital reconnaissance parity, as if it could be achieved. But it couldn't. Not then. Not with the tools the USSR had, the very foundations of Soviet strategic theory deception, dispersion, sudden mass were now obsolete, not by American weapons, but by American perception. And the realization swept across the Soviet elite with the cold clarity of a spy satellite's shutter click. We are no longer hidden. We are no longer safe. We are no longer in control. Decades later, long after the Soviet Union had crumbled, retired American intelligence officers gathered for a declassified symposium at the National Reconnaissance Office. One speaker, a former KH-9 mission controller, held up a black and white printout and smiled. "This," he said, "is the photograph that killed strategic opacity." The image was grainy by modern standards, but its message was razor-sharp, a Soviet ICBM convoy in motion, frozen mid-fuel, time-stamped to the second, the driver's shadows visible on the tarmac. A moment in time that changed everything, captured not with a missile or a drone, but by film dropped from space. For the Soviet Union, that moment never truly ended. Even today, in the Russian Federation, traces of Cold War paranoia remain in missile deployment strategies. Many bases are still camouflaged. Convoys move at night. Satellites are tracked obsessively. But the ghost of the American reconnaissance program still haunts their doctrine, not because the cameras fly overhead, but because of what they proved. That a superpower could be mapped. That secrets could be time-stamped. That fear doesn't come from the flash of a bomb, but from the silent certainty that someone is watching. The US never fired a shot to dismantle Soviet strategic superiority. It didn't have to. It launched cameras instead of missiles, lenses instead of warheads. And with every orbital pass, it shattered the idea that force alone defines power. Because in the Cold War, what you knew was just as lethal as what you built. And nothing was more terrifying than the truth, printed in high resolution, falling quietly from space.